In this video, the aim is to give you a number of strategies for tackling the AQA English Language Paper 1 question 5, which some people know as the creative writing question. I'll look at a number of strategies in terms of your content, but also in the way you might consider structuring the piece of writing. It's important to point out that this is not the only way of doing it, but these are strategies which might be of benefit to you in exam conditions when the pressure is on. So this is what the question looks like. You will be given an image and you are given two options for this piece of writing. Option 1 is always based on the image itself, and in option 2 you don't need to use the image at all. But as we'll look at later, you can still use the image in option 2 should you want to. So it's option 1 based on the image. Option 2 is on a prompt that is not related to the image itself. So here we've had a marketplace, we've had a young girl looking at a snow globe in her bedroom, we've had just an old man's face, we've had a picture of Grand Central Station in New York. It really can be anything. We've had a woman sat on a bus. It can be anything at all. The point is not to let the image restrict you. As you will see there, it says, write a description of an old person as suggested by this picture. It doesn't have to be about this old person. It doesn't have to be the features of this face. It's as suggested by. That's the key phrase. We'll have a quick look at the mark scheme. I'm only going to look at content and organisation. I'm not going to look at the technical accuracy element of this piece in this video. There are 24 marks for content and organisation and 16 for technical accuracy, but I'm just going to focus on the 24 marks here. So this is the top band of the mark scheme, and you'll see that each band is split into two sections, content and organisation. The content is what you write, the words you use, the devices you use, the tone and style of your piece of writing. And the organisation is about how you have structured your piece of writing. So I'm going to look at both in this video. And that's the lower bands of the mark scheme. The first tip I want to give you is to build yourself up a bank of metaphors that you can use in a piece of writing. Doesn't matter what the piece of writing is, some of these metaphors you will be able to use. And they are a beacon, a jungle or a forest, a blanket, a cloud, an ocean, a sea, a storm, a prison cell. And take your time to explore what the connotations of those symbols are, and therefore how they might work as metaphors. A beacon being a symbol of guidance, for example. A jungle might be a symbol for confusion. A blanket could be for comfort, but also for something that's smothering or claustrophobic. An ocean could be something that's overwhelming or dangerous, for example. So have a think about it. It might be worth mind mapping a few of those, the connotations of those symbols and how they might be used as metaphors. So let's have a look at how you might use these symbols as part of your metaphor and the way in which you can change the use of the symbol to change the effect of the metaphor. So let's take a blanket, for example. The ground below was smothered in a thick, cloying blanket of grey cloud. Here the blanket is something smothering, something claustrophobic, something repressive. But we can use the same metaphor in a completely different way. The ground below was protected from the callous sun by this soft blanket of wispy white cloud. Here the metaphor of the blanket becomes something comforting, something protective. So think about changing the way you're using the metaphor. Vinny and Jake were isolating, which turned room 36 into a tranquil sea of calm reflection with tides of learning coming in gentle but persistent waves. Here, the metaphor of the sea is used to turn room 36 into something calm and gentle. You can see in this example how I've extended the metaphor by using words in the semantic field of the sea or the ocean. We've got a tranquil sea, but also tides of learning and persistent waves. So you can extend your metaphor as well if you want to, but then in a different way, a similar metaphor is used for a completely different effect. Room 36 became a raging ocean of vitriolic noise as Vinny and Jake returned from isolation. Waves of disruption began to roll and swell. So the same metaphor is used in an entirely different way for a completely different effect. Semantic fields are the next thing that I'm going to suggest you think about in preparation for this question. Consider using a semantic field. A semantic field is where words can be grouped together under a common meaning. And using those in a paragraph or even in just a sentence or throughout your piece of writing is something your examiner is going to notice. Here's an example. A blockade of ashen clouds divided the earth from the heavens as the rain bombarded the ranks of lifeless trees below, the wind pummeling the exposed and vulnerable limbs. Here I'm trying to use words in the semantic field of warfare. As the orchestral breeze whistled through the tightly packed forest, the gentle melody of the leaves and branches was barely audible as the ensemble of starlings began the melodious evening chorus in operatic unison. I'm overdoing it here, but I'm trying to make the point here. I'm using the semantic field of music to tie my ideas together. And then finally, in the soft glow of the autumn sun kissed the plump cloud in a harmonious marriage of intense auburn and soft crimson. Here I'm trying to use words in the semantic field of love. And what I've done here is to put together some vocabulary which might be useful to you when thinking about semantic field. So thinking about how you might use these words in a description to tie your ideas together. We've got war, music, love, water and religion, but there are other semantic fields you might want to consider. But take your time to look at that vocabulary, and it might be, once you've established that vocabulary, be able to use it in your planning process for this piece of writing. So here's an option, here's a question. We've got an image here, and it's write a description as suggested by this image, or write a story about a catastrophic event. And you can choose either of those. The first one has to be based on the image, but only based on it. You don't have to be restricted by the image. Or the second one, you don't need to consider the image at all. So let's have a look at the first example here. This is example 1, the description based on the image. The heat was unbearable. The atmosphere was a raging ocean of fire, and smoke came in rolling but persistent waves. Trees were tossed and then destroyed in the vicious swell, and wildlife choked and drowned in the suffocating air. But you can see straight away, I hope, that even in the opening, I'm thinking about semantic field. Your examiner is going to be marking your script quite quickly, and it's a good idea to get these devices in quite early on. You'll be picking up your marks straight away. So in my opening paragraph, I'm employing a particular semantic field here, and I've maintained it all the way through. We've got the raging ocean, the persistent waves, the tossed in the vicious swell, and the drowning in the suffocating air. The semantic field of water or the ocean is being used here. In example 2, I'm choosing the second option, but I just wanted to point out that you can still use the image as inspiration for the second option. You don't have to discard the image just because you choose the second option. So this was about a catastrophic event. Alex's stomach and throat burned with the acid that always came with nerves. His mind was ablaze with negative thoughts, but all he could focus on were the charred remains of the memories of previous rejection. He hated job interviews. So in this one, I'm going to write the story about the catastrophic event, but I've used the image to help me create a semantic field to use in my opening. So don't ignore the image necessarily, even if you're choosing option 2. I mean, of course, you can ignore the image completely for option 2, but it's there to help you as well, and it might help you create a semantic field or a metaphor to use in your opening. A reminder then of the mark scheme before we look at structure. So I've just given you some tips there. The creation of metaphor and the employing of semantic field that will really help you score the bigger marks for content. Now we're going to have a look at structure. This is organisation. Varied and inventive use of structural features. Writing is compelling, incorporating a range of convincing and complex ideas, fluently linked paragraphs with seamlessly integrated discourse markers. We're going to have a look at what this looks like, how to link your ideas together, how to let the examiner know that you've thought about the structure of your piece of writing. Here's the opening structure that I'm recommending. You don't have to use this at all. This is just in case, like me, I'm not a particularly strong creative writer. It's not something that comes naturally to me. So I need processes and I need structures in place to support that. And certainly in exam conditions, structures and processes can be really, really useful, particularly when you've got quite savage time constraints against you. So the first thing I recommend starting with is setting the atmosphere, and setting the atmosphere by personifying the weather or nature. Make the weather or nature do something, and in personifying it, you create an atmosphere. If we think back to the images we had on the previous slides, it doesn't really matter what image you've got. You can always start with the weather. So even if it says write the description of the old man, you can take that old man and put him in a field, or put him stood outside a house, or put him sat in a chair on his front porch. Put him wherever you like. If you got the young girl in her bedroom, you can always start outside the house before you come inside. Same with the train station. If you've got the train station, you can start outside before you come inside. Don't be restricted by the image. So you can always start with the weather. When you're creating your atmosphere, I encourage students to think in terms of abstract nouns. What is the atmosphere they're trying to create? And if you think of an abstract noun, that will help you. Is it love? Is it anger? Is it hate? Is it depression? Is it happiness? Is it tranquility? Abstract nouns are often feelings. What feeling are you trying to create at the opening of your piece of writing? And after you've done that, after you've set the atmosphere by describing the scene and personifying the weather or nature, then it's time to zoom in on an object or person and describe them in minute detail. And if you don't have an object or person in your image, you put one in there in your mind. Again, don't be restricted by the image itself. Put whatever you want into that image, as long as it is still based upon what's in front of you. So we've got set the atmosphere, personify the weather, think of the abstract noun, and then zoom in. So my abstract noun that I'm going to start with is anger. That's what I want to create in my opening. You need to think about, what does that look like then? What are you going to describe to create anger? Instead of saying it's angry, you're going to create that. What would the weather look like? It might be cloudy, stormy, windy, raining. What sounds can you hear to create anger? Thunder, howling winds, squawking crows perhaps. But you can also do the same with your characters. I might describe the weather as being angry, but I might also want my character to match that mood. And therefore, what would a person look like who was angry? Colours might be red or grey or black. Clothing might be ripped, torn, ragged, rough. Features might be rough skin, bulging eyes, veins on the forehead, clenched fists. How might they be moving, running, stomping in a forceful manner? So think about how you're going to describe your characters as well to create that same feeling. And in doing that, you're showing the examiner not just that you're thinking about the content, but you're thinking about the structure, because the mood of your character matches the mood of the weather or atmosphere that you've created at the start. So you've thought carefully about how you're structuring your piece of writing. So here's another image with the two options. Either write a description as suggested by this image, or write a story about loneliness. I'm going to go with the description as suggested by the image again. So here's the example. I'm going to start with the weather, and I'm going to personify the weather. The high pitch of the pattering rain sang discordantly with the low vibrating tenor of the wind. The landscape was smothered in a cloying blanket of thick granite clouds which loomed over the vulnerable lake below. Thunder rumbled ominously while a wailing choir of crows squawked threateningly in the translucent sky. So as well as creating my angry atmosphere by personifying the weather, you can see that I've also used the metaphors we've been looking at. I've got the cloying blanket of thick granite clouds, and I've also used the semantic fields that we've already looked at. Here I hope you've picked up on the semantic field of music, the high pitch, the singing, the discordance, the vibrating tenor, the choir of crows. So I'm trying to get my devices in quite early. I've got personification, I've got metaphor, and I've got semantic field in this opening paragraph. I could carry on with that description, but just for the sake of showing you the structure, this is how I would go next. I'd now start to zoom in on character or building. Here I've put a man in this picture. A wizened old man emerged from the dilapidated hut, cloaked head to toe in the thickest black clothes, heaving through the still water. His face was a shade of deep crimson, with furrowed lines on his forehead and blackness around his monstrous eyes, which were bulging out of his skull. His calloused fists were firmly clenched, ready for action. And in my planning, I've tried to think about how I would create a figure of anger to match the atmosphere I've constructed at the start. So I'm showing the examiner that I've thought about the structure of my piece. Funnily enough, I put an old man in every single piece of creative writing, and you can do that. I build myself up descriptions of people and buildings that I can place into pretty much every piece of creative writing I ever do. It helps me because I'm not a particularly skilled creative writer, so I need those structures and I need those processes. You can do the same thing. I'm not saying you should practice one piece of creative writing, but you can certainly have stock descriptions that you can drop in to pieces of creative writing where they're appropriate. And then I can zoom in even further. If you look at the third paragraph here, the first two paragraphs are the same. I've got a bead of transparent sweat formed on his exposed forehead. It snaked slowly at first, then with increasing speed over the arch of his swollen eye socket and across his pitted cheek. It caressed the tip of his cracked upper lip where it entered his parched mouth, its cool saltiness awakening his dormant senses. So now I've written an entire paragraph about zooming in on a bead of sweat. And I also put this in most pieces of my writing. I bring an old man in, then I zoom in on the bead of sweat. I might change it to suit the purpose, but it's something that I tend to put into most of my pieces of writing because it helps me. But I've zoomed in and I've zoomed in again. You could zoom in on an object or a building, of course. So the atmosphere I've set at the start is exactly the same, but then I've zoomed in on the hut instead of the man. Next, so we've got set the atmosphere. Think of your abstract noun, the atmosphere you're trying to create. Zoom in on an object or person, then zoom in again and describe it in detail. Then the next thing you can do, the next structural shift, is to go from outside to inside and then include a one-line paragraph. So here we go from the bead of transparent sweat, and here I've gone inside the man's mind. He began to think about his dog. So going from outside to inside of a person would look to explore their thoughts. And then my one-line paragraph, loneliness filled his soul. And it's always good if the theme of that sentence can match the theme of the paragraph itself. The theme is about loneliness, which matches this notion of a single line stood on its own. An examiner is going to notice that and give you credit for a nice structural feature. If I've described the hut, I can then go inside the hut. If you've described a building, you can go inside the building. And I could write much, much more about the inside of that hut. I've just stopped it there for convenience of showing it to you. And then again followed with the one-line paragraph at the end. And then finally, you might carry that on for a bit. I'm not saying that's all you need to write, but then at the end, think about linking back to the beginning, because then you're showing the examiner that you've thought again about the structure of your piece of writing. So at the end, if I've started with the weather, I might go back to the weather at the end. And I might put a subtle change in. If I've started with anger and the clouds and the rain, maybe at the end the sun just starts to peep through those clouds to give us a sense of hope. But I can show the examiner that I've thought carefully about the structure of my piece of writing by linking the ending in some way to the beginning. So we've got set the atmosphere, abstract noun, zoom in again, go from outside to inside, a one-line paragraph and a link from the ending to the beginning is a suitable structure, I think, for a piece of creative writing. As I said, you don't have to use it, but it's there for you in case it's helpful, particularly in exam conditions. I'm going to show you now a real-life example. This was written by a student, a Year 11 student, and it was done in exam conditions, so in timed conditions. You can see, this was the image they were given, and you can see here is a student who has listened to this structure in class and is trying to follow it. Their plan: describe the weather, zoom in on the man, describe him in detail, describe the weather around him, so we're making links across the piece of writing. So you can see a student who's thinking about their plan here based on the structure that I've given them. And now you can see how the student started this piece. Started with the weather. The sky was a battlefield. The wind tore apart the swirling clouds like a shredded veil, permitting a murky smear of sunlight to escape its clutches. Low growls of thunder rumbled across the sky like a tank's wheels carelessly juddering across the ground. So straight away here is a student who's following the structure, but also using the semantic field of warfare. As an examiner, big ticks early on. You can then see in the second paragraph how they start zooming in on an object. And in this case, it's the weather. And then we come on to the man on our next one. We've got a one-line paragraph in here. Then we've got the description of the man, another one-line paragraph here. And the description of the man is linked to the weather in some way. So we've got a student following this structure, including metaphors, including semantic field. And this is a piece of writing which ended up with full marks in exam conditions. It's really well written, but it's also thoughtfully structured. And I haven't included the ending, but they go back to the weather at the end of this piece of writing. So it's just an example of how in exam conditions, that structure, those metaphors, those semantic fields, those descriptions of the man, descriptions of buildings that you've prepared in advance can really, really help you. I'm not saying you should learn bits of creative writing, not at all. But if you've got little bits and pieces that you can include in your creative writing, that's really going to help your process. So to finish, a reminder of hints and tips that are going to help you. Develop a bank of metaphors that you might use depending on the picture you get. Develop a vocabulary of different semantic fields that you can employ depending on the picture that you get. Think carefully about how you're structuring your piece of writing and making links between different areas of your writing. And then for definite, link the ending and the beginning in some way, because that's your examiner's final thought on your piece of writing, and they'll be able to see clearly that you've thought about the link between the ending and the beginning.